So now what? I'm sure you've heard the statement before, or maybe even said it yourself. So now what? Now, a lot of times maybe it happens when you finish what you're doing, and then you say, so what do we do now? Yeah, maybe you hung out with some friends or family, and you finish it. So now what? But other times, it's said out of frustration or desperation. You have a problem, and it's like, what do we do now? So now what? And sometimes that problem or that situation is a problem that you didn't create. It just kind of happened to you. For example, about a week ago, we had fires burning out here, and several people had to evacuate from their homes. They got the order, get out. And he said, so now what? Where are we going? What do we do? But other times that situation comes about because of something that you did do. You've done something that's put you in a tight spot. For example, that time you were driving and you knew you needed gas, but you thought, I can make it there. And then you end up dead on the side of the road. Your car dead on the side of the road, sorry. Let me clarify there. You end up with your car dead on the side of the road. And you say, so now what? Then, sometimes we find ourselves in that situation, and we may have caused it, brought it about onto ourselves, but we still don't recognize the fact that we caused it, or we don't want to admit it. Because you say, well, you know what? I could have made it if it wasn't for the traffic. I could have made it if I didn't get stopped at those lights. Really? Well, possibly. But you knew you needed gas. You knew. But sometimes we just don't want to admit it. And when somebody does something like that or says something like that, you hear about that situation. We can laugh about it. We may even shake our heads. But you know what? It isn't funny when you find yourself in a bad situation asking, so now what? And the reason that you're in that situation is because of some unwise, sinful choice that you have made, or some ungodly action that you have taken. And what's even worse is when you are confronted with how you got there, confronted with how you have turned away from God, how you chose to sin, and you don't recognize it, or you aren't willing to admit it. But then when you do see it, and you do admit it, there's still the question, so now what? You see, this is what we see in Israel. As we turn back into 1 Samuel chapter 12, this is what we see happening. You see, the last couple weeks, we've been talking about Saul. We met Saul, and we found out that he was very hesitant to take any kind of leadership. But God called him to be king, and he became king and eventually led the people into a victory in battle. But Saul becoming king all started with a request from the people. The people said, we want a king. And the people didn't think anything about their request. They didn't think it was a problem. There was nothing negative about it. They just simply said, we want a king. And they're like, this makes sense. It's reasonable. This request, it's fine. And by the way, everyone else has a king, so why shouldn't we? And so they didn't think anything of their king. But now we see Samuel. And Samuel now has a message for the people. So we'll begin in chapter 12, verses 1 through 5. It says, and Samuel said to all Israel, behold, I have obeyed your voice in all that you said to me, and have made a king over you. And now behold, the king walks before you. And I am old and gray, and behold, my sons are with you. I have walked before you from my youth until this day. Here I am. testify against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Or whose donkey have I taken? Or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or from whose hand have I taken a bribe to blind my eyes with it? Testify against me, and I will restore it to you. They said, you have not defrauded us or oppressed us or taken anything from any man's hand. And he said to them, the Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day, that you have not found anything in my hand. And they said, he is witness. And so here we are, we find us in Israel in a time of transition. They're changing from the political leader, from being the judges, from the book of Judges we've talked about, from being judges to the king taking the lead and leading the government. But as a prophet, Samuel will still also be the spiritual leader in Israel, even though the political leadership has changed. But at this time of transition, Samuel is going to confront and encourage and challenge the people of Israel. But first, before he gets to that, he reaffirms his own credibility. So he's going to talk to them. He says, do I have credibility to speak to you? And so he gives them the opportunity to accuse him of any wrongdoing that he's done. He says, have I abused my power in any way? Have I acted dishonestly? Have I taken anything from you I shouldn't have? Have I done anything wrong? And the people said, no, he hasn't done anything. But Samuel also offers that if he has done something wrong, that he will make up for it. He will repay them. But the people say, no, you've done nothing wrong. And so Samuel calls on God as a witness. So basically he's saying, you better mean it. Because God is testifying here, or witnessing what you are saying, that I've done nothing wrong. But what we see happening here is that Samuel's integrity is fully intact. And what he says is trustworthy. And when he speaks the truth. And so he's not going to start lying to them now. He's not going to falsely accuse them now. And see, this is important for a spiritual leader, or for anyone. If you are going to lead someone, or if you are going to teach someone, or if you are going to confront or challenge someone, then you've got to have integrity. Now, that doesn't mean that you're perfect, that you never do anything wrong, but it means that you live an upright life. You do what is right, and when you do mess up, you admit it and you make it right. Otherwise, people won't listen to you. People won't hear anything you have to say. And so now let's move on to the actual message that Samuel has for God's people. He's going to say to them, you messed up. Do you see it? So look at verses 6 through 13. It says, and Samuel said to the people, the Lord is witness, who appointed Moses and Aaron and brought your fathers up out of the land of Egypt. Now therefore stand still, that I may plead with you before the Lord concerning all the righteous deeds of the Lord that he performed for you and for your fathers. When Jacob went into Egypt and the Egyptians oppressed them, then your fathers cried out to the Lord, and the Lord sent Moses and Aaron, who brought your fathers out of Egypt and made them dwell in this place. But they forgot the Lord their God, and he sold them into the hand of Sisera, commander of the army of Hazor, and into the hand of the Philistines, and into the hand of the king of Moab, and they fought against them. And they cried out to the Lord and said, we have sinned because we have forsaken the Lord and have served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. But now deliver us out of the hand of our enemies, that we may serve you. And the Lord sent Jerubbaal, which is the other name of Gideon, and Barak, and Jephthah, and Samuel, and delivered you out of the hand of your enemies on every side, and you lived in safety. But when you saw that Nahash, the king of the Ammonites, came against you, you said to me, no, but a king shall reign over us, when the Lord, your God, was your king. But now behold the king whom you have chosen, for whom you have asked. Behold, the Lord has set a king over you." So Samuel is here. He's challenging the people in the presence of their God. And he starts by reminding them of the relationship they have with him and reminding them of all that he has done for them. You see, God has always been faithful to his people, even when they were not. And so he goes and he tells the stories. It reminds them of a few things in their history. He says when Jacob's family, went down to Egypt. So Joseph went down first, and then the rest of the family came down. After a little time, the Egyptians eventually started to oppress the family of Jacob, oppress the Israelites, and eventually made them slaves. And God says, but the people cried out to God for help. And what did God do? He helped them. He delivered them. And so he did that by sending Moses and Aaron to lead and to deliver the people out of Egypt. And then he brought them it took a little while, but he brought them to their new land, and he gave them that new land. It says, this is your new home, and you can live here. And what we see in Israel's history is that when the people were faithful and obedient to God, and when they trusted God, that God blessed them. Things went well for them. He provided for them and protected them just as he promised he would. But several times in their history, they turned away from God. And so God disciplined them by sending enemies to attack them or oppress them. And when the people realized what was happening, that this was happening, it was God's discipline upon them, and that they had done wrong, they then confessed their sin and turned back to God and began to trust in God. And what did God do? He delivered them. Why? Because God is faithful to his people. And he gave them judges to help deliver them and to lead them. Because God is faithful. But then, he says, when Nahash and the Ammonites came against you. Now, we just heard about Nahash and the Ammonites last week. Because when they came up and they surrounded the city of Jabesh, and then the messengers went out, and Saul found out about it, and then brought the Israelites over, the army over, and conquered Nahash. We just heard about them, but apparently Nahash and the Ammonites have been causing problems for the Israelites before this. They've been causing problems over there in that area. And says that when Nahash came and when they attacked, what did the Israelites do? They immediately turned. They didn't turn to God. They didn't trust in God. What did they do? We want a king. They immediately turned away from God and wanted the king. And Samuel is saying here, that was rebellion. That was sin. That was wrong. Because you turned away from God. You wanted a man that you could trust in to save you, rather than trusting in God. Now, I have to admit something. And I think some of you would probably understand, or probably all of us would agree. Sometimes it's easier to trust someone that we can touch and see. And we fall into that. We want a person to trust in rather than God. But Samuel says that's rebellion. And by the way, there is no man, no human being who is worthy of our trust like God is. But in case the Israelites hear this and think that it's no big deal that they asked for a king, I mean, after all, God went ahead and gave them a king, right? So they could very easily say, look, we asked for the king. I know Samuel said, whatever, it wasn't good. But look, God gave us a king. It must not have been bad. In case they don't realize it, Samuel is now confronting them with it and telling them that this was wrong and you have rebelled against your God. Keep reading verses 14 through 18. He says, if you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king. Now, therefore, stand still and see this great thing that the Lord will do before your eyes. Is it not wheat harvest today? I will call upon the Lord that he may send thunder and rain, and you shall know and see that your wickedness is great, which you have done in the sight of the Lord, in asking for yourselves a king. So Samuel called upon the Lord, and the Lord sent thunder and rain that day, and all the people greatly feared the Lord and Samuel. And so God had given them a king. But this king will be different than other kings. Now, you remember they said, give us a king like all the other nations. But this king will be different than other kings, because this king is still a servant of God. And he serves as God's representative amongst his people and to lead his people. And he's leading for God, but he leads by following God. And so both the people and the king still have to obey God, because they are still God's people, not the king's people. And so they need to recognize that their well-being still depends on God, not just the king, not just this man who has been put over them. And so Samuel says, if you fear God, in other words, if you respect him, if you honor God, what will you do? You will serve him. You will obey him. And so just like in the past, if they are faithful to God, God will bless them. And just like in the past, if they are unfaithful to God and they refuse to obey him, they will experience his discipline as well. And they will find themselves in a difficult situation in order that they may turn to God and get right. But then Samuel real quickly says, in case they didn't get it, or in case they heard what he said but didn't really take it seriously, or in case they flat out didn't believe him. You know, like the people heard what he said and they say, yeah, you know, Samuel, you're just a little nitpicky. You're just a little over the top. You're a little too spiritual, too religious. Whatever it is, whatever comment they might make. In case they heard it but they didn't really believe it, they didn't really take it seriously. Before they can make any argument to Samuel, he says, watch this. And he is going to give them a miraculous sign to prove that what he has said is true, and to prove that what he has said is from God. So they can't argue with it. That they will know it's true, that they have rebelled against their God and sinned against him. And so Samuel asks God to make it thunder and rain. And it storms. Now, why is this miraculous? Well, if you caught it, Samuel said to him, before he said, I'm going to make it rain, or pray for God to make it rain, he says, isn't today the wheat harvest? It's the wrong time of year for it to rain. Okay, this is the beginning of the dry season. It was extremely rare for it to rain at this time, let alone thunder and to really storm. But on top of that, when the people see it rain, they've got to be thinking, oh no. Why? Because too much rain will destroy their crops. It's harvest time, not time for rain and for them to grow. It's time for them to harvest. Too much rain or too strong of a storm could destroy their crops. And then what would that leave them with? Without food. And so they recognize the severity. They immediately understand the severity of their situation, and that what they have done was evil. It was sin against their God. They had rejected their God as their leader and as their protector. And they had asked for a man to replace him. Now, when we hear that, it doesn't seem to make much sense, does it? But that's what they had asked for. And in doing it, they also asked to be like everyone else, rather than the holy, unique people of God. You see, sometimes we sin, but we don't see it. For whatever reason, we do something that is wrong, that God doesn't approve of, but we don't see it. You see, if you are a child of God, then you are to be like him. Now that's a pretty high standard, isn't it? We are to be holy as he is holy. But if you are a child of God, you are to be like him. You are to act like him. But sometimes we do things that are out of character for us as children of God, that don't match up to the character of God. And sometimes we do those things without even giving it a second thought. Or we do it and we justify it as if it's reasonable, it makes sense, it's no big deal. Well, I know I did it, but it helped me. It was very practical. Or this is just the way the world works. Everyone does this. Why shouldn't I? Well, because it's not like God. If it doesn't match God's character, it's a big deal. So we shouldn't sin and say, it's no big deal. Everyone does it. It's the way of the world. If it's not fitting to God's character, then it's not right. In fact, if it's not fitting to God's character, then it's rebellion. And you are giving the rule of your life to someone else other than God. Maybe yourself, maybe your friends, maybe your family, whatever it is, who's saying, do it this way, not God's way. And I'd say it's better to recognize that it's sin, and better to avoid that experience of discipline from God than to go through it and have to be disciplined. Because you know what? God is faithful. God is faithful. You know what that means? That means he is faithful. He will do good for you. But it also means that he will be faithful to discipline you. Because Hebrews says that God disciplines those whom he loves. So if you are sinning, if you are turning away from God, or if you are living in a way or doing things that are out of character for a child of God, he will discipline you because he is faithful. Well, at this point, the people of Israel finally get it. They understand that they have done wrong and that they are in danger of discipline. So what now? What do they do? Well, look at verses 19 through 25. And all the people said to Samuel, "Pray for your servants to the Lord your God that we may not die." You see, they understood what they deserved. Pray that we may not die. For we have added to all our sins this evil to ask for ourselves a king. And Samuel said to the people, "Do not be afraid. You have done all this evil. Yet do not turn aside from following the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. And do not turn aside after empty things that cannot profit or deliver, for they are empty. For the Lord will not forsake his people for his great name's sake, because it has pleased the Lord to make you a people for himself. Moreover, as for me, far be it from me that I should sin against the Lord by ceasing to pray for you. And I will instruct you in the good and the right way. Only fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king." You see, the people, they responded correctly. Samuel had challenged them and they recognized their sin. And they confessed their sin. And they said, what should we do now? They asked for what they needed to do about it. You see, they're actually afraid here. They're afraid of being punished. They know that they deserve it and that God is able to carry it out and that God has the right to do it. And so they're scared. And Samuel's answer is just great. Because Samuel, he says several things to them. The first thing he says is, don't worry about it. Just don't turn away from God again. He says, live for God now. Now, what he doesn't mean by this is, oh, well, that doesn't matter. It was just sin, but no big deal. Rather, what he's saying is that you have done the right thing. You have recognized that it was sin, and you have confessed it. So now leave it behind and faithfully follow God. He's saying it's forgiven. If you've confessed it, then God has forgiven you, and it's in the past, and so it's done. It's over. It's gone. So don't worry about things that are in the past, and just follow God now. It's time to move forward. The second thing he says you need to fear God. In other words, you need to recognize just how awesome and holy he is and obey him and serve him wholeheartedly. In other words, not just in part, not kind of give him lip service, but serve him and obey him wholeheartedly with all that you are. Give yourself fully to him and trust in him. He says, don't trust in anything else, in these empty things. He says, they can't help you. So don't trust in them. Don't follow idols or anything else that can't really help you like God can. The third thing Samuel tells them is that God will be faithful. But how do we know that God will be faithful? Well, because that's who he is. Is God ever not faithful? No. Wait, I want to know if you ask. Do you know the answer to that question? Is God ever not faithful? No. He's always faithful. That's who he is. That's his character. He tells them, remember all that he's done for you. Think back about that. Consider all he's done. And if you do that, he has a reputation to uphold. What's his reputation? That he is gracious, that he is faithful. He has a great name. He's known for his grace, and he's known for his faithfulness. And he is not going to do anything that goes against his character and that ruins his reputation, that drags down his name. He says he will continue to be faithful. And so he's always faithful, even if his people are not. And so if his people serve and obey him, he will bless them. If they rebel and turn away from him, he will discipline them. And they can count on it. Both of those things. And the fourth thing Samuel says is that he promises to pray for them and teach them. Why? Because this is his responsibility as a spiritual leader. He says, that's my job. As a prophet of God, I'm a spiritual leader. And if I don't continue to pray for you and teach you, then I am sinning. I would be disobeying God. So he says, I will continue to do that. Now, see, when I see this, again, I think Samuel's answer is awesome. This is all awesome. Because think about this. God is faithful and forgiving. So even if we mess up, and even though we don't deserve his forgiveness, we don't deserve his faithfulness, he gives it anyways. Now we know we don't all deserve it, right? What's Romans 3:23 say? For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. We've fallen short of his character, of his standard of holiness. Every one of us, we don't deserve his goodness and his mercy, but he gives it to us anyways. And we see this perfectly in the cross. You see, we rebelled against God, starting with Adam and Eve. The first people, we chose to do things our own way rather than God's way. We chose to trust ourselves or someone else rather than God. But God sent Jesus to be born as a baby, to grow up and live out his life and never sin, and to be put to death on a cross in order to pay the price for our sin. You see, he took the punishment so we don't have to. That is the grace and the faithfulness of God. And everyone who believes in Jesus will be forgiven of their sins and will be saved, delivered. And God promises that because he is faithful. But you know, even after we are saved, even after you are a child of God, we still sin. We still mess up. We fail to perfectly obey and follow him. But even when we still sin, God is still faithful. And he offers forgiveness and renewed fellowship to us. That's what 1 John 1:9 says. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just. He's righteous. He will do the right thing. He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins. He will live up to his character, his reputation, to who he is, and he will forgive you. You see, God blesses his people when they obey him and when they live for him wholeheartedly. We experience comfort from God. We experience strength from God. God gives wisdom. God gives us peace that passes understanding. Even when we're in a situation where it makes no sense, we can be at peace. Why? Because God is with us. God blesses his people. But God also disciplines us when we turn from him, and when we sin, and when we don't repent of those things that we do that are out of God's character, and when we don't confess. And here's one other thing that I know some people sometimes struggle with. Say you messed up. You've done something. There is some sin in your past. You've confessed it. You have repented from it. But for some reason, you can't move on. So now what? You confessed it. You repented it. So now what? Well, it's actually quite simple. Move on. That's what Samuel told us. He said, move on. And do what? Be faithful now. He says, you've messed up, but don't beat yourself up over it. Don't beat yourself up over past sins. You know why? They're in the past. If you have confessed that sin, God has forgiven you of that sin, and it's all been paid for. When Jesus hung on the cross, he paid for your sin that you confessed and you have asked for forgiveness for. It's been forgiven. It's gone. There's no way. Don't act as if you have to pay some kind of penance. There's nothing you can do to pay for your sin. You know that, right? Jesus has already paid for it. And if you have confessed it and it's been forgiven, it's gone. It's in the past. It's history. So don't dwell on it. But live for God now. Just move forward. So where are you this morning? See, I think there are some of us who may be standing at a crossroads. And we need to decide, am I going to move forward, or am I going to stay here at this crossroads, or am I going to go the wrong way? One of those crossroads may be that you've never experienced God's forgiveness. And you've been cut off from God from your sin. And you have the opportunity now, and God offers his forgiveness to you and says, come to me and believe in Jesus. He died on the cross for your sins. He paid the price so you could be forgiven and know God. You can have a relationship with him. You can live for him because Jesus paid the price. And today's the day to make that decision. To move on from that crossroads and say, I'm going to follow God. I'm going to believe in Jesus. I'm going to be forgiven for my sins, and my life will be changed. And now I can live for God and live with Him forever in eternity. But some of you may be at a crossroads where there is sin in your life. And you are either ignoring it or justifying it. Or maybe neither. You're just choosing to hold on to it because you want to do it. Keep doing it. But there is sin in your life. It could be something like envy or jealousy. It could be ungodly thoughts or words. It could be anger or bitterness. Immorality or impurity. Idolatry or anything that you put before God or trust instead of God. Anything or anyone that you've put before Him. It could be arrogance. It could be impatience. It could be being rude or unkind. It could be holding grudges. It could be anything. I could go on forever. I took every one of those out of the Bible. Anything that goes against the character of God. Anything that doesn't match who He is. Is there something in your life that you are holding on to, or you are justifying, or you are ignoring that does not fit the character of God? You are standing at a crossroad this morning and God is calling you to move forward. If you are a follower of Jesus, a child of God, these things should not be a part of our lives. We need to recognize it. We need to admit it, confess it, and then move on and be faithful to our God. And then a third crossroad. Someone may be standing at that crossroad this morning, struggling with a past sin. Something that happened in the past, you just can't seem to let it go. You've confessed it. And if you've confessed it, then you've been forgiven. And God says that in the Psalms, it says that He's removed our sin as far as the east is from the west. In other words, they can't come close. It's gone. So that means it's in the past. God's forgiven it. You've got to let it go. Leave it behind you and follow Jesus now. Or as Paul put it, forgetting everything that lies behind, I press on. I press on to the higher calling. So what now? If you're standing at any of those crossroads, I encourage you to move today. God is calling. He's calling us to move, to forget what lies behind, to move forward, and to be obedient and be faithful, because He is faithful. So whatever your situation is, live for God now.